61, which is on the board, and we'll also read text 62, which has a short purport. Caitanya Nityanande Tanra Parama Vishvasa Caitanya Charite Tanra Parama Ulasa Caitanya Nityananda Tanra Parama Vivasha Caitanya Charite Tanra Parama Ulasha
Caitanya Nityananda Tanra Parama Vishvasa Caitanya Charite Tanra Parama Ulasa.
So I might just read the next verse and then we'll go back and do all the word for word together. Vaishnavera gunagrahi na dekaya dosha kaya mano vakre kare Vaishnava santosha. So text 61. Caitanya. Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu. Nityananda. In Lord Nityananda. Tanra, his, Parama, very great, Vishvasa, faith, Caitanya Charite, in the pastimes of Lord Caitanya, Tanra, his, Parama, great, Ulasa, satisfaction. Translation. Pandit Haridas had great faith in Lord Caitanya and Nityananda. Therefore he took great satisfaction in knowing about their pastimes and qualities. And I'll do translation of text 62. He always accepted the good qualities of Vaishnavas and never found fault in them. He engaged his heart and soul only to satisfy the Vaishnavas. Purport by Srila Prabhupada, it is a qualification of a Vaishnava that he is a dosha darshi. He never sees others' faults. Of course, every human being has both good qualities and faults. Therefore, it is said, sajana gunam ichanti dosham ichanti pamara. Everyone has a combination of faults and glories, but a Vaishnava, a sober man, accepts only a man's glories and not his faults. For flies seek sores, whereas honeybees seek honey. Haridas Pandit never found fault with a Vaishnava, but considered only his good qualities. We can repeat these translations, please, after me. Pandit Haridas had great faith in Lord Caitanya and Nityananda. Therefore he took great satisfaction in knowing about their pastimes and qualities. He always accepted the good qualities of Vaishnavas and never found fault in them. He engaged his heart and soul only to satisfy the Vaishnavas. Omagana Timirandasya Ginanjana Shalakaya Chakshu Unmaditam Jena Tasmai Sri Guruve Namaha. I was born in the darkness of ignorance, and my spiritual master has very kindly come, forced to open my eyes with your torchlight of transcendental knowledge. I offer my most respectful obeisances unto his lotus feet. Mukam karoti vachalam pangum longhayate garim yat kripa tamaham vande Sri Gurum Dinatarinam. By the grace of the spiritual master, even a lame man can cross over mountains, a blind man can see stars in the sky, and a dumb man can recite eloquent Vedic poetry. Long, long ago, there was an assembly of saintly persons in the forest of Naimisaranya. And Bhrigu Muni was designated by those assembled saintly persons to find out conclusively who was actually the supreme amongst the three principal devatas, Lord Vishnu, Lord Brahma and Lord Shiva. This wasn't an assignment that Bhrigu Muni particularly relished having to do, but as it's said, along with the order of the spiritual master comes the ability to fulfill that order. So Bhrigu Muni was very strategic, as they say nowadays, in finding out conclusively who was the supreme, specifically who was completely transcendental, no longer influenced by any of the three modes of material nature, who was actually situated in supreme goodness. We have the three modes, goodness, passion and ignorance, and there is also Shuddha Sattva, which is pure goodness. So first he went to his father on Brahma Loka, Lord Brahma, and his father was very happy to see his son, but Bhrigu Muni practically ignored his father. He stayed at some distance and didn't offer all the usual courtesies of civilized children towards their parents. He didn't come and touch the feet of his exalted father, offer obeisances, inquire after his father's well-being. In fact, he just looked around. Occasionally, he glanced at his father from a distance, and he noticed that there were all the symptoms, if you like, the physiological symptoms were there manifesting in Chaturmukha Brahma, the four faces of Lord Brahma. He could see his father was becoming enraged. But Lord Brahma was able to control his anger by his Brahma Tejas, his spiritual Brahminical powers. So Bhrigu Muni quickly left that place, and he went to see his brother, Lord Shiva, who was famous as Asutosh, means one who is very easily pleased and also very easily displeased, which means Lord Shiva can get angry quite quickly. And his expansions also have that particular characteristic. So Lord Shiva was delighted also to see his brother Bhrigu Muni, and he ran towards him to embrace his long-lost brother, but Bhrigu Muni put his hands up in protest and said, "Don't touch me. Look at you. You're covered in the ashes from crematoriums. You wear a garland of human skulls. Good to note that those skulls are not the skulls of ordinary mundane persons, but actually they're the skulls of great Vaishnavas who have departed this world. He has live snakes crawling over his body. He wears animal skins like the skin of tigers or deer. And he's surrounded by many very fallen and unfortunate people who he's giving shelter to." So again, Bhrigu Muni noticed in the physiological characteristics of his brother that he was very angry also, being neglected in this way. So he left that place. And that place was, of course, Mount Kailash, the abode of Lord Shiva and his consort Parvati. Next, he went to Swetadweep, the Vaikuntha planet in this material world, where Lord Vishnu resides. And without any warning whatsoever, Bhrigu Muni rushed into the palace of the Lord and proceeded to kick Lord Vishnu in the chest very hard. And rather than become upset, Lord Vishnu became most apologetic, came down and took the lotus feet, you could say, of Bhrigu Muni and began to massage them and asked what offence he must have committed that Bhrigu Muni felt the need to do this. And surely Bhrigu Muni's foot had been injured, so the Lord was massaging his foot in this way and apologising. So of course Bhrigu Muni could understand Lord Vishnu is actually completely transcendental. He didn't become affected in any way at all. Of course, the Lord's consort, his wife, the goddess of fortune, Lakshmi, was not impressed whatsoever. And it's said from that point on, Brahminical persons are often neglected by Lakshmi. Brahmins, since time immemorial, have often lived in a very poor state, without much material opulence. As a result of this, the curse of Goddess Lakshmi, you could say. Not in all cases, but in many cases. Of course, Brahminical persons, they're quite happy to live simply. Simple living, high thinking is a motto of the Brahminical class. And they're quite satisfied just with the bare necessities of life and to be able to perform their spiritual practices. So Prabhupada describes this pastime in the Krishna book, and he gives a really wonderful, very, very profound statement. He says there that a person's greatness can be understood by how they can tolerate provoking situations. And provoking situations can come in both positive and negative ways. For example, aspiring transcendentalists may be tempted by Maya. Will be tempted by Maya to, for example, give up spiritual practices, fall down from following regulative principles, and so on. Go back to very mundane life. But sincere and serious aspiring devotee transcendentalists, they tolerate that provocation. And there are many wonderful examples of that, like Namacharya Haridas Thakur being tempted on 2 occasions, one by a very beautiful young professional prostitute sent by the envious Ram Chandra Khan to discredit him, and also by Maya Devi herself, who came in person. So, but Namacharya Haridas Thakur was so blissfully chanting the holy names of Krishna practically all day and night that he was immovable. And similarly, there are provocations which come in a negative fashion, you could say, where we may feel, even in the association of devotees, some negative feelings towards others. When they provoke us, we don't remain steadfast. We react to their provocation. Rather than be dhira, we become adhira. Dhira means sober, and adhira means not sober. Dhira, dhira, jana priyo. It's described the 6 Goswamis of Vrindavan were very dear both to the gentle and to the ruffians because they were not envious of anybody. So this example is very appropriate, how to remain steadfast in all situations and not to commit offences, because we do get a reaction, and it's said that those reactions, as that pastime with Bhrigu Muni describes, the least severe is just an offence in the mind, which in Kali Yuga it's said we're all forgiven for, because many of us, our minds are out of control, and we may think so many impure thoughts. So, but we're forgiven for that, and according to Hari Bhakti Vilas, and Srila Sanatan Goswami, and also Gopal Bhatta Goswami's wonderful book on the, which is described like the handbook for aspiring devotees, even to think badly about a devotee, not to be jubilant when we see a devotee. That's, of course, not good, and one has to check that propensity, or try to control it at least. So there are offences in the mind. Similarly, as Bhrigu Muni uttered harsh words against his brother, Lord Shiva, that is a more severe type of an offence. To actually blaspheme a devotee, criticise a devotee like that. And then, of course, sometimes tempers fray and get heated to such a point that devotees actually fight with one another. Not good. Sometimes it happens. Not so much nowadays. Early days, occasionally there were some hot heads, but we don't need to go there and discuss that. Though Prabhupada did share a pastime, he met a gentleman in the 1930s who complained to Prabhupada that he'd seen these so-called Vaishnavas, but all they did was sleep and snore. And Prabhupada said, "You have not seen a Vaishnava. Have you seen Arjuna? No. Have you seen Hanuman? No. Then you haven't actually seen a Vaishnava. You've only seen pseudo Vaishnavas, false devotees. Because, of course, they're extraordinary devotees, Hanumanji and Arjuna, because they fought. They were fighters for Krishna and Lord Ramachandra. So we're not being asked to do that, but at least in our general dealings with our fellow devotees, no fighting. So I just want to cover this thoroughly before we move on, because I have copious notes here, but we only ever get to speak some of them. Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. All right. Yes. Let's see. That's page 1. Hare Krishna. Also, this ties in, yes. Some of us are reading a wonderful book at the moment, the memoirs, you could say, His Holiness Giriraj Swami, of his years in Bombay. And a little background, in 1970, August to be exact, Prabhupada moved back to India. And one person asked Prabhupada when he arrived back in India for an extended stay, "Didn't Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati ask you to preach in English in the West?" And Prabhupada replied, "But I've already done that." So Prabhupada came back to Bombay, and pretty much from that point on, Prabhupada spent half of his time, half of each year in India, and the other half of the year travelling in the West, more or less. And he spent the most time in Bombay, 556 days. And on one occasion he stayed there and didn't move for 3 months, when all of the legal challenges were going on with the infamous Mr. Nair, corrupt businessman trying to cheat Prabhupada and the devotees out of the land at Juhu Beach. So anyway, there's one pastime there which is really enthralling. There are many pastimes, but one which is riveting was Prabhupada's interaction with one retired Bombay doctor, Dr. Patel. And Dr. Patel became very fond of Prabhupada and would meet up with him whenever Prabhupada was in Bombay and doing his morning walks along Juhu Beach with his disciples. Dr. Patel also lived in Juhu Beach. He was a little younger than Prabhupada, a few years maybe, a few years. And they would have, and Dr. Patel was very well educated and knew a lot of Sanskrit, and would say that he was actually a Vaishnava. But often he would argue in favour of the Mayavadi impersonalists. And Prabhupada would defeat his philosophical misconceptions. And sometimes tempers would get heated. There would be shouting matches. And but this went on, and sometimes the devotees would complain to Prabhupada, "Prabhupada, why do you bother this man? He says he's a Vaishnava, but then he comes out and argues vociferously in favour of the Mayavadis." And it came to a head one morning when Dr. Patel was glorifying one famous Indian Mayavadi sannyasi. And Prabhupada became very angry, became very upset, and was very critical, highly critical. And Dr. Patel complained to Prabhupada that we have been taught here in India to respect all the saints. And Prabhupada countered that I have been taught to point out who is actually saint and who is swindler, cheater, because they're not all saintly. So, and when Prabhupada returned to the temple, he told a story to the devotees, because the devotees were very upset. They didn't like Prabhupada's health wasn't good. So when they would see Prabhupada get angry, that they were very concerned for Prabhupada's health. So Prabhupada told a story when they got back to the temple of a man who used to boast to his friends. This man actually knew many different foreign languages fluently. And whenever he would meet someone from another country, he would immediately start talking to that person in the fluent language of their country. And his friends would often ask him, "Dear Mr. So-and-so, what is your mother tongue? What language is it that you actually knew or you learned from your parents when you were a child?" And this man would say, no, I've always known all of these languages since I can remember. So the friends devised a trick to actually find out what in fact was his original mother tongue. And a couple of them ran behind him one day when he was not expecting, and they slapped him very hard on the back. And this man turned around and he cursed and he swore in what was actually his original language. And then they all knew, aha, you see. So Prabhupada explained, this morning I pushed on the pressure point and he revealed himself as actually a Mayavadi. Yeah. When I criticized this person, it was actually bogus, but very famous in India, then he actually revealed him. He might say, I am Vaishnava, but actually when I pressed him, so I really like that story of Prabhupada. So, and of course, and just a little, we're going to do a few historical pastimes this morning, which we've been reading and hearing about lately. Another event in the history of Vaishnavism, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, our line, is when there was a great struggle for India's independence, as we well know. And during the 1930s, 1940s, of course, there was one very famous freedom fighter, a Bengali gentleman, Subhash Chandra Bose, after who, if I'm not mistaken, Calcutta Airport is named. And he came to see Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur on one occasion, trying to enlist some manpower from Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, who was attracting many persons, very high-class people too, from not only Bengal but other parts of India as well, and they were becoming his disciples, and many young men in particular were becoming renunciants, brahmacharis and sannyasis, and preaching very vigorously Mahaprabhu's teachings all over the subcontinent. So Subhas Chandra Bose, he thought, we should get some of these young men from Gaudiya Math and enlist them in the freedom struggle. So he came and he made an appointment and came and met Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he said, these men will not be of much use to you. Just see, they are very skinny and hungry looking, because it was Chaturmasya and it was the custom of the brahmacharis and sannyasis to observe Chaturmasya very strictly. So they were all just eating very minimally, performing austerities. So he went away empty-handed. In that way, of course, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati avoided any of his disciples having to go and fight, because Subhas Chandra Bose, he actually had even been to Germany and Japan and met with high-ranking military officers and made deals with them that any of the Indian soldiers fighting on behalf of the British Raj, if they're captured by you, you hand them over to me. And he actually had guerrilla fighters in India and across the border in Burma making raids. And though they weren't many, they were having a demoralizing effect on the British soldiers. And ultimately, it's said that had more of an effect than Gandhi's non-cooperation civil disobedience movement in helping England finally grant India her independence. So in this regard, Prabhupada was sitting on one occasion in his room in the Calcutta Temple. It was about the mid-70s by this time, and his movement was continuing to steadily grow all over the world. And Prabhupada was thinking out aloud, as they say. Why am I the lucky one? And it was in reference to many of his godbrothers who, like himself, were born in very cultured families. It was the strategy of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur and his son Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati to preach to the very high-class people. Because Achirati stressed us, whatever a great man does, common men follow, and whatever actions he performs, all the world pursues. That's a statement in Bhagavad Gita. So both Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur and his son Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, they purposefully were preaching amongst the very high-class persons, attracting them, because that had not been done so much for hundreds of years. And many high-class people were looking down, so to speak, on the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition as being just for lower-class people. So Bhaktisiddhanta was attracting these many very high-class persons. But Prabhupada, that statement, why am I the lucky one, was in reference to his illustrious god-brethren, many who also did extraordinary service in helping their Guru Maharaj establish 64 temples throughout India and overseas branches as well in Burma and London. But Prabhupada's extraordinary service to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. And then Prabhupada answered his own question by saying, because I never deviated. I was absolutely fixed on this instruction that I received from Guru Maharaj. And again, to quote, along with the order of the spiritual master comes the ability to execute it, the potency to execute it. And another wonderful famous quotation in this regard is that the spiritual master lives forever through his divine instructions, and the disciple lives with him. So there is... So Prabhupada reflected in this way, and he told an interesting story of identity. And it's a very traditional story of a girl growing up in a very orthodox Indian family whose identity when she's a girl is that I am the daughter of my father. But then later on in life she gets married, and then her identity changes to I am the wife of my husband. So Prabhupada explained, similarly, when a devotee takes initiation, then our identities change. Now I am a disciple of my spiritual master. And there's two interesting examples. When Satsvarup Das Goswami was asked by Srila Prabhupada if he wanted to take initiation, one of the very first, in either the first or second initiations, Satsvarup Maharaj said yes he would, and he thought he owed it to his biological father to tell him that he was taking initiation from an Indian guru. His father became very upset. He said, if you do that, son, I disown you. You're no longer a son of mine. Satsvarup Maharaj was also upset, and he went to Prabhupada, who was of course known as Swamiji in those days, and said, this is the situation. But Satsvarup Maharaj, after thinking about it a little bit, had come to the realization that Prabhupada was actually his real eternal father. And he put that to Srila Prabhupada, who humbly acknowledged, yes, that's actually the fact. So of course he went ahead and took initiation. Not sure if father ever made up with son. Another interesting story that Bir Krishna Goswami shared with us last time I think he visited here was his Maharaj's biological father had recently passed away, and his father had remarried, and Bir Krishna Maharaj got word, possibly through one of his siblings, that their father had passed away. And his father was a very rich man. So Bir Krishna Maharaj was thinking, perhaps our father left me some money that I can donate towards the construction of the Temple of the Vedic Planetarium in Mayapur. So he was expecting. But then word came through the solicitors handling the estate that his father had in fact left him something. One item only was in the will to be given to his son, Bir Krishna Goswami. Anyone know what that was? His gun. Son got the gun. And of course Bir Krishna Maharaj said, I don't like guns. I don't know anything about guns. It was kind of bizarre, to say the least. And Bir Krishna Maharaj has a disciple in America who has a few guns and is a bit into guns, so he said, here, you have the gun. So that's bizarre things that go on in family life sometimes. I even heard, and Ramai Maharaj, you can correct me here, I've heard a couple of versions of this. Prabhupada's first passport that he used to come to America, perhaps there's a section in most passports where it may have had occupation, and I think Prabhupada wrote servant of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada. I think that's how I've seen it or heard it. Some might have said once upon a time that where it had father's name, Prabhupada put Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. But anyway, that was Prabhupada's. But Prabhupada admitted on many occasions, and he dedicated one volume at least of his Krishna book trilogy to his own biological father, Gaur Mahan De, who Prabhupada said was a pure devotee of Krishna and Jagannath, and was extremely grateful to his biological father for the wonderful training he got as a boy in Krishna consciousness, which was later on carried on by his eternal father, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. And Prabhupada does mention and says in one purport that he and his spiritual master were very fortunate to be born in such, especially his spiritual master, to be born in an Acharya family, where Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's father, of course, was the great Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So, all right, Krishna. So I might stop here and just see if anyone would like to add a comment, a question, or if there's if anyone has. Not sure if we have a microphone, but we can always repeat the questions. We do have Krishna Kirtan. That's okay. We can repeat. Are there any questions or comments this morning? All right, Krishna, Krishna. Everyone's happy. Yeah, probably.
So you said that Prabhupada had told his friend that he hadn't seen a devotee, that he hadn't seen a true Vaishnava. He asked, have you seen Arjuna, have you seen Hanuman? No, that he hadn't seen a true Vaishnava. So I'm wondering what that means for the rest of us. It's not in that category.
Well, Prabhupada is making the point that someone has to be quite heroic in our ability to fight both for our own spiritual lives and also to defend Krishna when Krishna's challenged, so to speak. So, of course, there's an internal struggle going on for every aspiring devotee, but also what's borne out in the incredible struggle Prabhupada had to go through throughout his life, and especially as a world acharya, to establish Krishna consciousness and to seek Krishna glorified far and wide throughout the world. That fighting spirit, as I think Mukunda Maharaj quoted, and he was personally there in the University of California campus in Berkeley, and this would have been late 60s, when a young Indian man, student, complained to Prabhupada that what was the use of this spiritual practices? What we need is technology, and he'd come from India specifically for higher education. And Prabhupada, it was the first time Mukunda Maharaj actually saw Prabhupada angry at this young man, and Prabhupada explained that I've not come here to America like you to beg something. I've actually come here to give something most substantial. This is India's great contribution to the world, is spiritual knowledge. And this is a theme that comes out because there was so much mistrust in India that Prabhupada's young Western disciples were CIA agents, and Prabhupada had to very pragmatically point out, look, I am bringing men from the West and I'm bringing money from the West, and it won't cost India one paisa. So that fighting spirit, just as we're sitting here in this beautiful temple room with plans to build an even more magnificent temple for their lordships in the years ahead, in these beautiful hills of far northern New South Wales, and even on a rainy, misty day like today, it's still beautiful. I have one devotee friend who's still trying to decide whether New Govardhana is more beautiful on a misty day or a bright sunshine day, because that same beauty is there in different ways. So this temple didn't come about without a great struggle. Things that are very worthwhile quite often come after a great fight and struggle. So I think that's the point that Prabhupada was making there, that the man had seen fellows just sleeping, basically, not doing anything, but Prabhupada's mood and the mood of his Guru Maharaj and the line, the Gaudiya line, is very much to propagate, to share Krishna consciousness with others. In 1968 in Boston, Prabhupada made this statement: "We want this certificate from Krishna. This man has done something for me." Man, woman. That was very early days. We want this certificate from Krishna. This person has done something for me. So to do anything for Krishna, one has to fight. Great struggle. Not passive. Bhakti is dynamic, active. Similarly, Prabhupada was invited during his time in Bombay to a Bhagavad Gita conference in the vicinity of Mahatma Gandhi's ashram, either in Gujarat or Maharashtra, wherever it was. And Prabhupada wasn't so much inclined to go. He knew what these Bhagavad Gita conferences were all about, and there were going to be other hardcore Mayavadi sannyasis there presenting their philosophies. But the organisers of the conference were insistent that Prabhupada had to come. By that time, Prabhupada was very famous throughout India and the world, and it would make their conference very prestigious to have him there. So reluctantly, but Prabhupada demanded some conditions. He said, "You have to pay for myself and 10 of my Western disciples to come there, and all of our expenses. And I want one evening," and it was the night before the conference was to start, "where we are given facility to have one program just on our own. I will speak and my Western disciples will do kirtan, and you have to publicise that, advertise that." It's exactly what happened. They agreed to all those conditions, and the night before the conference, 1,000 of the local people came. Prabhupada spoke very strongly. Devotees performed ecstatic kirtan. They showed a film, one of the films that were being produced in those days, and everyone had a wonderful time. So this fighting spirit is sometimes, very much, not sometimes, but always, even on a personal level, and to propagate Mahaprabhu's teachings is required. Anything else? Haribol. Oh, can I just add something to that?
Yeah.
In my notes here. The next morning, this is just about, it all ties in somehow or other. This is criticism, back to criticism. Okay. So the next morning, Prabhupada was on a morning walk, and Vasu Ghosh Prabhu started to say, "Srila Prabhupada, it's said that Mahatma Gandhi," and at that point Prabhupada cut him off and said, "You have to know the art of criticising, and you do not know the art." Because he knew his disciple Vasu Ghosh, his Western American disciple, was going to say something negative about Mahatma Gandhi, because they'd actually been to Mahatma Gandhi's ashram the day before. They'd been given a tour of Mahatma Gandhi's ashram. So I just wanted to make that point. Premanjali?
I was just wondering, you made a point in the beginning of your class about if we see a devotee and we don't feel happy when we see that devotee, how that's a sign of our own character not being maybe the way it should be. And I was wondering in that regard, kind of what defines someone as a devotee, and also I guess in that sense, living with our families, or because we're surrounded by devotees so many times, there's so many like personal interactions that will go on, something happens. Then on top of that, kind of how do we deal with that when there is something going on, and then how to progress in that correct direction?
Well, if there is some let's call it a misunderstanding or some conflict, and Mataji is here, who knows a little bit more about conflict resolution, but it's the nature of the material world that there will be disagreements, and Prabhupada always said in a family, brothers and sisters will often fight, but that doesn't mean they don't still love each other. Of course, if it gets serious, then what Vaishnavas are recommended to do is go to the person who they feel, whether rightly or wrongly, they may have offended, and offer obeisances and beg forgiveness for whatever offence they may or may not have committed. So that's the Vaishnav way. Best, of course, not to commit offences. Getting angry a lot of the time is symptomatic that one is still very much in the mode of passion, Rajaguna. And Rajaguna, we used to have this expression, purified passion, where devotees would do a lot of extraordinary, heroic service because they were passionate by nature, and they were also highly intelligent, and they could achieve a lot. And Prabhupada engaged those early disciples and continues to engage so many of us. And everyone has a different temperament and everyone has a different nature. So is that, Premanjali, is that a little helpful? Okay. Excellent. Anything else? Okay. Jai. Sri Caitanya Charitamrita ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Gaur Premanandi.